Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is wonderful to be here with you on this fine evening. We have an unbelievable program. My name is Marjan Shirzad, and I am the Sacerdote Chair of Education and Outreach here at the Nantucket Historical Association. And on behalf of the staff here at the NHA and at the Nantucket Cottage Hospital, we welcome you to a night of delightful stories. And we know and acknowledge that you all have stories to share as well. So I will say there will be time for your stories at the end of this evening's program. So stick around, we want to hear all of them. Before we get started, let's just take one moment to silence our cell phones so that we can be whisked back in time and really get the mood going. And thank you to our friends at NCTV who are here making sure that this is recorded, that it becomes a part of Nantucket history for those who can't be here tonight. We appreciate it very much. When our team and friends at the Cottage Hospital approached us a few months back and said, would you all be interested in hosting a night of oral histories to bring out stories of Nantucket nurses? I think we all spontaneously broke out in huge smiles and said, yes, please. And it's through the hard work of the team at the Cottage Hospital, Brenda, Courtney, Jason, and others, that we're able to do this evening. And I also want to let you know, since you're here, you'll be the first to know, that we are doing more of these. This will be a series. I won't say exactly what topic will be next, but I assure you they will all be fascinating. So without any further ado, I wanted to thank you for being here. And I also wanted to say the lovely lady at the entrance, Lexi Norton, who is our membership coordinator, would like to offer you 2 free all-access passes if you are not a member, and join tonight, gift a membership, renew an old membership. June is our Member Appreciation Month, and it's because of our members that we're able to do things like this free for the community. So if you are a member, thank you. And if you're tempted to become a member, you should be. Now, really, without further ado, I would like to introduce this evening's moderator, the Nantucket Cottage Hospital's Jason Graziadei first.
Good evening.
Check. And I would really like a warm welcome. I will say all their names at once, and then they can come in together as a group. Ms. Janet Coffin, Brenda Johnson, Jill Johnson, Suzanne Sullivan, Charlene Thurston, and Kate O'Riordan. Jason, it's over to you.
All right, thanks, Marjan, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. Thanks to the Historical Association for hosting us. I want to just start off and just give you a brief sense. I think Marjan touched on this, but the sort of genesis for this, what we're doing tonight, as you know, we're just a few days away from the groundbreaking for Nantucket Cottage Hospital's new facility. So it's a very momentous time for the hospital, for the community, a real celebration of the future, but at the same time, we do want to honor the past and everyone who has gotten us to this point. We have many longtime staff members who have recently retired or are coming to the ends of their careers, and they really have these amazing stories about the hospital, the people and the community that they served, and just what it's like providing medical care on a remote island. So this idea was born to kind of capture these stories and that not only tell the history of Nantucket Cottage Hospital, but in many ways the history of the island as well. So tonight we have this great panel to share this history with you. And before I introduce and say a little bit about them, I also want to recognize and acknowledge that in the audience tonight, we have many current and former Nantucket Cottage Hospital nurses. And so we want to make sure that we give them the opportunity as well to come up and share their memories and their stories at the end of the program when we get through the panel. It's so hard to put together a panel like this because there's so many people who could have been on it. You know, in the couple days before we got here, I received a call from a former Cottage Hospital nurse who said, well, you know, I was a nurse at the original Cottage Hospital and this hospital. You've got all the young nurses up here. So, you know, there could have been any number of folks who are on there, but we're very happy to have them here tonight. And we want to make sure that everyone knows there'll be an opportunity to come up and say, you know, give a memory or tell a story. And just one more thing before I introduce the panel. Since we are doing a little bit of a throwback tonight and talking about history, I think we just need to adjust one thing up here on the screen behind us. The old logo, right? That's a little bit more appropriate. So briefly, I'm going to introduce the panel. To my right, Suzanne Sullivan started at the hospital in 1969 and just recently retired last year after 47 years of service at Nantucket Cottage Hospital. Started at Nantucket Cottage Hospital in 1979 and just last month retired from the hospital. So we were just celebrating her. Brenda Johnson has actually been volunteering at the hospital since she was 12 years old and started her career as a nurse at Nantucket Cottage Hospital in 1975 and is currently our clinical program director for the new hospital project. Janet Coffin actually started her career 1 year after the current hospital was built in 1958. So please welcome Janet. Kata Reardon began working at the hospital the same year as Brenda in 1975 and is currently one of our nurses in the operating room.
Hiring.
Charlene Thurston, she started her career at Nantucket Cottage Hospital in 1973 and is currently the program director and nurse practitioner for palliative and supportive care of Nantucket. So we thought we'd start off tonight and have each of the nurses give you a little brief synopsis of how they got to Nantucket, how they started their career in nursing, just to give you a little background before we jump into some of the topics that we're going to hit tonight. So I'll turn it over to Suzanne.
I had a family here. My family came even before I was born, and I thought everybody came to Nantucket in the summer. And when I was 14, I started doing volunteer work at the hospital, and I see some of the nurses that were working 3 to 11 at the time. And I just always wanted to be a nurse, always. So I am. I was.
I'm Jill Johnson. I arrived in 1979. I'd never been here for a summer. It was in September, and I came into the hospital just to see what it was like. I interviewed with Charlene Thurston and Janet Folger, and they asked if I could start to work in 2 days. I was, at the time, working in Florida, and I was in charge of an intensive care unit. I went back to Florida. I gave them 2 weeks' notice, and I arrived at their doorstep, and I've been here ever since.
So I'm Brenda Johnson, and I grew up here. I grew up with my grandparents mostly, and Goldie Howes Rogerson was my grandmother's best friend. So I would see Goldie every night at our house in her uniform and her radio, and I wanted to be just like her. And so Mary Jean Brock and Lori Bartlett and myself went to nursing school, and we all came back as summer nurses. I was going into the Air Force, and I met the X-ray tech and ended up marrying him instead, and have had quite a career here. I've done emergency room, operating room, labor and delivery, special care unit, visiting nurses, compliance, privacy, and Dr. Hartman asked me if I would do a project for her, and that would be the clinical project director for the new building. Oh, and I was also the manager for imaging for a while. So I've had quite the career at Nantucket Cottage Hospital, and I actually still have fun, so that's why I'm not retired.
Hi, I am Janet Coffin. I graduated from Nantucket High School way back in 1952. And I attended 2 years of college up in Vermont, and I transferred to the nursing program originally at Cornell New York Hospital. And I wasn't that happy in New York City, so I came back and got accepted at Mass General, and I graduated from Mass General in 1958.
Hi, I'm Kate O'Riordan. I came to Nantucket probably in 1969, and I just came to vacation, and we'd come every year with my sister and her husband, and we stayed at Martin's Guest House. In 1975, I graduated from Northeastern, but nursing was a second career for me. I was a secretary before that. And I went into nursing for purely practical reasons, to be able to go anywhere I wanted to and do any lifestyle I wanted to. This was the lifestyle I wanted. So I came down here and did 2 co-ops here. I did another co-op in an operating room and landed up coming here in 75 as an aide, 78 as a regular nurse, and I've been here since, so.
So I'm Charlene Thurston, and actually how I got here was one of my favorite stories, because I had been working at Mass General Hospital for 5 years, and I was 24 when I came here. And I'd been head nurse on a general surgical floor, and it was very, it was like Mass General Hospital today, very cutting edge, working with the best and the brightest, and thinking, oh my gosh, at 24, you're thinking, wow, I have really got something to offer that hospital. and so I came, I was going with the man who became my husband, Barry Thurston, and I called up to see if I could, come for the summer, because I figured I'd better figure out whether I'd like living in Nantucket if our relationship was going to go any further, because I was from the city. And I called up and I spoke to Goldie Rogerson, who Brenda mentioned was the director of nursing at the time. And I said, hi, I'd love to, come, and this is what I've been doing. And I thought she would just say, great, come on down. And she said, oh no, dear, we're all filled up. We don't need anybody. I thought, what a crushing blow. So finally she said, well, why do you want to come anyway? And I said, well, I'm going with someone who lives in Nantucket, so I thought I'd like to come and work there. And she said, oh really, who's your boyfriend, dear? And I said, Barry Thurston. She said, oh, Barry Thurston, sure, come on down. So I always loved the fact that I couldn't get the job on my own. I had to wait for my husband to be able to give me an in and get me into Nantucket. So it's been great ever since. You can see I've stayed a long time and married Barry.
So I thought we could start tonight talking and just have the ladies kind of set the scene for us and talk about the hospital when they first started in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's a little bit different than it is today. The hospital today is a 19-bed facility. A lot of the care is outpatient. When these ladies started, we were talking about 50 inpatients on the floor. Some of the things and the things that were allowed in the hospital were different. You had patients smoking in the rooms, etc. So maybe Charlene, you could kick us off and just kind of give us a sense of what the hospital was like when you first started, and the scene around the hospital, and some of the things that maybe were a little different than they are today.
So actually, it was amazing what the hospital was like. As I said, I was at Mass General, and so you would expect that there'd be a huge difference between, working with the really, really sick patients that would be at Mass General Hospital then, and coming to a little tiny community hospital. The way things were then was nursing was at a very different place, as it probably would be today, between Mass General Hospital and Nantucket Cottage Hospital. But coming in, it was really startling because, patients were very well taken care of. The staff really loved them. Everybody was really devoted to them, and gave them really wonderful personal care. But the nursing care at the time was at a very different level. So I used to think, every patient was sort of a bed, a bath, and a blood pressure. It was sort of just basic nursing with a lot of care and a lot of love and attention. But the nurses at that time would pass out basins, metal wash basins. They take them out of the utility room and have to pass them out every morning, help the patients get bathed, collect them all, and then go clean the basins in the utility room after that. And they take blood pressure, give back rubs, which you don't see too much of these days, and they should definitely come back in. And blood pressure, but nurses were very much just sort of personal care assistants for the most part, and always would do what the doctor wanted, very much subservient to the doctors. You didn't do things on your own. So Brenda and I were sort of talking about the fact earlier that when the first time that I had a patient who really got into some serious trouble, pulmonary edema was the problem that he was having. He couldn't breathe, his heart was failing, his lungs were filling up, and so I automatically said to one of the other staff members, we have to sit him up, put the oxygen on, go get the EKG machine, and go get the doctor right away. And she said, oh no dear, we don't do that here. And it's like, whoa, we have to do that if we're going to save this patient. So one of the things that's really interesting is that although I came from a pretty sophisticated nursing background, I actually had more emergencies and more cardiac arrests in the first year that I was here than I had had in my previous 5 years at Mass General. And I think it was because at that time, nurses weren't as involved physiologically with what was going on with the patient, didn't know didn't take action as quickly on their own yet. That was yet to come. So that's what we were able to sort of bring in. So it was just a very different place of nursing at the time, but it's been amazing.
Suzanne, you want to share with us some of your first memories of working at Nantucket Cottage Hospital? Don't forget the mic.
I'm not used to a microphone. I wanted to say to Charlene, one thing that we forgot, or when she came, but when I was first working there, technology, we did not have monitors or automatic blood pressure machines or things to take your O2 sat or anything. There was nothing like that. Even in labor and delivery, when you first went there, you not only were a nurse on the floor, you worked in labor and delivery, the emergency room. It was what comes, you go. My first experience, the first couple of weeks that I worked days. And I remember Goldie House, who I love dearly. She was one that I kept saying when I was 14, please let me be, I want to be a volunteer, I want to be a volunteer. And so I went at night, and I thought I was about 50 years old, all grown up and ready to be a nurse. And I could pass some cranberry juice and things. But it was very, very exciting. And I would actually look at the nurses at the nurses' station, and I just thought, they look so beautiful and so organized, and everything was so wonderful. And the patients just loved all of them. I mean, what more could you ask for? But anyway, she did ask me when I first worked as an RN that would I like to go on a flight. It was an Air Force flight. And I went as a nurse in my cap and gown, white shoes, nylons, and everything else, in an Air Force jet, and flew a person from Sconset who had a stroke, and we flew her to Teterboro Air Force Base in an Air Force jet. And I was the nurse. Now, I hadn't even been on a jet, I don't think, in my life before. Big planes, but not a jet. And I had 2 Air Force pilots. We went to Teterboro, dropped the patient off. They then took me to lunch in the officers' club, which is very exciting. Now, I had just been married about a month before this, and I'm looking, and then they said, here, want to come with us? And they took me to a hospital flight of men coming, or people coming back from Vietnam, and this was in 1969, and I was allowed to go on this hospital plane. There were 20, I will never forget, there were 22 young people, basically my age, and I remember turning my wedding ring around and saying, oh, no, I've got to go in the Air Force or something. This was, but that only lasted till the afternoon. They flew me back on the jet here to Nantucket, so that was my first flight, air flight. Somebody else must have some transport.
Well, I wanted to expound on that as far as the transports. They were scary so scary to go on, you can't imagine, because they literally took the seats out of like a Will's Air, Gull's Air. That was a transport off. There was no med flight. They put you on these flights. You couldn't hear blood pressure if your life depended on it, because we didn't have the automatic machines. We didn't have the O2 sat. And you just said, please let me get to Boston. Please let me get to Boston. Please let this person be breathing. Please, please. And they were really scary to go on, but it's the only way that we got them off of here. And you would come back literally like a surfboard, holding the stretcher, hoping that you could get back, and a lot of times you didn't. You landed up at like the Air Force Base on the Cape, you know. And I remember one particular flight, we were only going to the Cape, and it was a gentleman who had a GI bleed. And we actually worked with this gentleman, and we had to get him over there. And it was the middle of winter, and he had blood running. I get on, I don't know the we came. I get on the flight with him, and the blood is running. It's so cold, the blood is freezing. So I'm taking the blood and I'm putting it between my legs, trying to keep it warm until he got there. So it was quite an experience. We were so happy when med flight came on the scene, and still are so thankful.
So going back to setting the scene in the hospital, one thing I learned in talking to these women, that there was such a thing back when they first started called cocktail hour in the hospital. And I was very curious about this. So, Jill, can you tell us a little bit, what was cocktail hour? For patients.
Well, they had orders, so I don't want you to think we just did this. The physicians would order the cocktails, and we actually did have cocktail hour. We would pass the card along and make the cocktails to the patient's specific requirements at the time, and our physicians were very involved in that, too.
As I remember, Jill, it was in the pharmacy that we had a little liquor stash.
We did. We had the whole bar.
We never
set
were
up.
allowed to go in there ourselves, mind you.
But you know, it was also the patient's own alcohol. I remember one lady vividly. The office that I'm in presently used to be a patient room, so I can actually remember all the patients that were in these offices and rooms, and you know, my interaction with them. And this particular woman, lovely lady, she drank Boodles. Now, I didn't even know what Boodles was. I can tell you it's a gin now. And I can remember making her boodles and whatever, and popcorn, and sitting there watching TV with her. So you didn't wait at the nurse's station. You spent time with your patients while they drank or smoked a cigarette or whatever they did. Not to minimize the fact that they were in there for a medical condition and we were taking care of them medically, but these are things you wouldn't be doing nowadays.
Well, we also made milkshakes. They were called fraps. I'd never heard that word before. Okay, we're making you a frap. And one thing I found out once I arrived on Nantucket is all the patients wanted coffee fraps. Another thing that I'd never heard of. So we were making them with instant coffee and their ice cream. Do you remember they all wanted fraps?
I'm known for my creamsicle fraps, and people to this day that worked in labor and delivery with me remember that. I'm known for hand-holding and fraps. Yeah.
The other thing you never knew is we had a doorbell in the emergency room, and they would ring the doorbell. It was many years later before we even had a camera. So you never knew what you were going to get in the emergency room. You had patients on the floor. Someone would come to the emergency room, ring a doorbell, and we'd go down. You could have a cardiac arrest, you could have a child with a cough. You never knew what you were going to get. But I went down the stairs one day and I got a deer in the back seat of a car. And the deer woke up fine, lacerated the back of that car like you wouldn't believe, but off he went. But also at the time, we acted as the MSPCA. So we, on off hours and off shifts, we did everything. We made all the phone calls to the MSPCA and got the vets in so that they could see the patients as far as pets.
And there were no physicians in the ED. There was no one in the ED. It was you going down to an empty ED, and then you had to find the physician while you're trying to juggle the patient and figure out what's going on there. So you had to find the doc who was on call, and we didn't have a dedicated nursing department or physicians then. So.
Just for everyone in the audience, we talked about our own hospital lingo. So ED is emergency department. We all know what it means, but just so everyone in the audience is aware.
But just jumping off on something that both Kate and Jill just said, and going back to the kind of nursing that it was then, one of the things that was amazing is that, I was telling you before about the difference between working at a big hospital like Mass General and then coming to Nantucket Cottage Hospital. In many, many ways, working at Nantucket Cottage Hospital was really much harder. When you worked on a floor at Mass General Hospital, like I said, I had worked on a general surgical floor, you knew automatically exactly what kinds of patients you have. There might be some variety in them, but you knew that all of your patients were going to be general surgery patients, and you knew all your beds were going to be full, so you always knew what your census was going to be, how many nurses you were going to need to staff it, and you were able to educate your staff around what they needed to know to take good care of those patients. When you were here coming into Nantucket Cottage Hospital, you never knew what was coming through the door. You didn't know whether you were going to have a patient coming in with a heart attack, a GI bleed, having a baby, or a fishhook. And I actually used to say, please give me a good GI bleed any day. I don't know what to do with these damn fishhooks. But it's much, much more difficult nursing, and it remains that way today because you don't get enough volume of one type of patient to really have enough practice to really excel in it all the time. And yet you're needing to know, these are all specialties, cardiac, GI, surgery, labor and delivery, emergency room, all of those are all specialties in nursing. So you need a whole body of knowledge for each thing. But when you were working here, you needed to know something about how to take care of all of those different patients. And it's really much, much more difficult. You had to be a generalist.
So one of the things I recognized when I came to Nantucket Cottage Hospital as a brand new nurse, you're full of ideas and, you want to be the best. I had no idea who was a nurse and who wasn't a nurse working because we had people, remember Flossie Francis and remember Mert Jewett? They were LPNs by proxy, but what happened? The state gave them an LPN license? So they just, became LPNs. There wasn't any training. They took care of patients during the war?
Yeah.
And so the state sort of said, okay, now you're an LPN. So you never know who was what. Lucille Legg was a nurse's aide. She was fabulous. But EMS, Emergency Medical Services, didn't start on Nantucket until 1973, which meant that the hospital had the ambulance service. So not only were you responsible for doing surgery or working in the emergency room, but you were also the ambulance service. And I believe Walter Beinecke gave money for the first ambulance, which was a station wagon. But when I got there, I remember it being a van, and we had the orderlies, Driscoll, Mr. Driscoll, and Cahoon. They were all
Was the name of that van Willie Make It?
I don't know, but because I was too nervous. But anyways, I can remember going out on ambulance calls. So Jill's job would be to clean the kitchen. Your job would be to look at the code cart because Charlene had brought code carts to Nantucket, and my job would be to go out in the ambulance with the orderly. And so Charlene, you went on a pretty interesting thing, and that's actually what started Emergency Medical Services on Nantucket.
So it was the first summer that I was working here, and as Brenda was saying, there were no EMTs then here, and there was no ambulance service, and we would be, and nurses would just be assigned to work wherever they were needed. So you're either on the floor, the general floor that you know now, except that all the beds were filled. So where there are offices now in the new wing, those were all bedrooms. Those were all patient care rooms. So we would have a census sometimes of 50 patients. So you'd be working, if you were on the floor, you'd be working on the floor. If you're working in the obstetrical unit, you'd be there. Or if you're in the emergency room, you'd be there. And a call would come into the nurse's station that an ambulance was needed. And so the charge nurse or whomever would say, and she would just pick one of the nurses off the floor. So this particular day, she said, Charlene, you go out on the ambulance. There's a bicycle accident. And so we weren't really oriented to those things yet. So I went out, and as Brenda was saying, you had 2 orderlies with you who were not EMTs. They were nice men who gave personal care and also helped lugging, doing the heavy lifting and driving this van, which was what we had to go out in. And the van was just like these vans that you see. It had like little cubby holes in it where there would be, some of the cubby holes would have blood pressure cuffs, and another one, would have different kinds of equipment, and they would have a couple of stretchers. Thank God they actually even had scissor stretcher on it. So out I'd go to the Pulpus Road and to what I thought was a bicycle accident, and there's somebody on the ground, and a young man who seemed as though he was in a daze sort of said, "Oh, he's over here." So I went and took care of the patient and asked how she was, whether she could move anything. And, she'd fallen from this bicycle, I thought. And so we had, we lifted that patient with the scissor stretcher, put her on the regular stretcher, and had her put into the van to go back. And then he says, there's another person over here. And I'm thinking, oh no, there's another patient here then. And so off we go, and I thought, there must have been 2 bicycles or something. So off we go, and we look at that particular person and go through the same routine. Can you move everything? Are you okay? And put a neck brace on, put him on the stretcher, get him into the ambulance. And it turned out that this was a huge accident, and it was a van that had flipped a Jeep that had flipped over. And so there actually ended up being 7 people injured in this, and I was all alone as a nurse from the floor with a couple of orderlies with me. Luckily, I think by that time they had radioed the police to come, but remember, there are no EMTs, so we're doing all of this alone, putting these patients back into the van or into a police car and so forth. So it was really it's quite unbelievable, some of the things that you had to do.
Amazing you didn't go running back to MGH and Barry kept you.
And so one thing I learned in talking to them was, as Charlene just said, the major sort of events in island history, they were all part of these events in some way. So one of them that we talked about was actually in 1958, the Northeast plane crash. So this happened 1 year after the Prospect Street Hospital had just opened. This was a passenger flight from LaGuardia that crashed on approach to Nantucket Memorial Airport. 22 of the 31 passengers were killed, and actually Janet was had just started working at the hospital at that year. So Janet, can you tell us a little about what happened in the aftermath of the crash?
Actually, it was really a very frightening scene. They brought in, it was ambulances running all the time. We have to give credit, though, to Nantucket, to the old hospital, because they did have good planning, and they carried out for any kind of emergency like that. And it was just with the cooperation of the hospital and the police and the fire department and we ended up flying a good portion of them off island, and it was a rainy night, but flights were coming in and out. Everyone, there were some of the doctors from off island, that were visiting, came to assist. It was a regular team group, and everything went fine in getting them off. The only sad part was there was one little girl, that was probably 2 or 3, that was left in the one in the one room, for children, and she was sitting up playing the next day and not knowing that her mother was killed in the crash. So it was very sad on that part, but I commend all the staff and all the auxiliary help, and they did a wonderful job in transferring people off. It was an all-night scene, and I had just graduated from the general just about 2 months before that, and so and we didn't really deal with any major trauma there, as a student. So it was really quite a challenge, but everything went well, and even in the old hospital they did an excellent job in carrying through with everything.
And another thing we talked about was up until recently on our campus, we had something called the nurses' dorm. And in recent years, it wasn't actually a dorm, it was offices and meeting space. But how it got its name is it truly was the dormitory for the nurses. And actually, I think Jill and Charlene were residents of the nurses' dormitory. So they told me some stories about a den mother is what you called it. Is that true?
I had Heathy. Heathy was my dorm mother, and she kept an eye on us, but we all still, maybe there's some stories we can't tell. We snuck guys in, but she made sure that we kept the place clean and that we were somewhat responsible and checked the time that we were coming in, even though she wasn't really, we didn't really go to the corner or anything. But it was quite a fun time because it was, for me, a time when I met other nurses and I met other people on the island. I remember meeting Roberta Santos and I were in the dorm at the same time. So we were able to, it made a camaraderie, it developed friendships that continue to this day, and even from off-island people. So it was quite an experience, and it was kind of sad to see it come down, but we're getting ready for the new place, and that's going to be fun too.
What are your memories, Charlene, of the nurses'
Well,
dorm?
I think sort of like Jill's. One of the things that was great about it was that when I first, I was 24 when I came, so when I thought that I was going to have to live in a dormitory, a nurse's dormitory, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not like 16 anymore. But it was really great. As Jill said, you sort of had great camaraderie, and you always had playmates. So when you got out of work at 3:00 here, you were in your room by 3:02. It was none of this, I'd been used to before. An hour and a half later, I'm sort of dragging myself in after an hour and a half commute. But here, you're out of work at 3 and you're in the dorm by 3:02. So you had all this great time to play, and you always had playmates around. So it was really great. But speaking, there was a house mother when I was there too, a different one, and this one was quite a character actually. She smoked cigarettes, so she'd have like a cigarette hanging out of her mouth a lot, and she'd wear this T-shirt over a brace that she had on, and she was just quite a character. So she'd be, looking out the window, checking out, and so I was going with Barry, so he'd be driving me back, and you're in the back, and you sort of see the little shade going, So it was pretty colorful. I was there for 2 years, but of course, when up until last year, I was back in there. That's where my office was.
So, these colorful characters, we've already talked about some of them, and you guys had mentioned in, talking amongst each other, preparing for tonight, some of the other really colorful characters that you've worked with over the years at the hospital, and a lot of you talked about a name that probably a lot of people in this room know, Dr. Voorhees. Talk a little bit about him, and a lot of you brought up this Dr. Voorhees and his, did he have a snake, is that right?
Yeah. I hate snakes.
Among other things.
So Dr. Voorhees, first of all, he was what I would consider your true country doctor. He was a wonderful diagnostician. He was crazy. He loved music. He was very intellectual. And he liked the shock value. I can remember calling, in those days we had radios. It was 483 calling whoever we were calling. And you'd be calling a physician, and all of a sudden Dr. Voorhees would pipe up and say, Dr. Voorhees is to 483, can I help you? That's sort of extraordinary, and I don't know that you would have that happen nowadays. But he would come in and make rounds at all hours of the night, and he had a boa constrictor that do you guys remember the boa constrictor? Huh. So he would have the boa constrictor wrapped around him. He'd be making rounds, and some of us would be flipping out because, of course, I don't like snakes. He would bring his friends in. He had some colorful friends, and we would be explaining what we were doing nursing-wise so that he had an understanding of what we were doing. But he was always bringing animals in, bringing animals into the X-ray department. Those days you called it X-ray, now you call it imaging.
He wasn't the only one.
Yes, I know. I know. But
We have a doctor today.
I know.
Well, Dr. Voorhees always had this habit, as I'm sure you guys remember, of humming. He'd just be humming all the time. When he stopped humming, you should worry. When he didn't hum, you were in trouble. He was a
All of our doctors were good. We had, for those of you who remember Dr. Folger, and then Dr. Collins, Dr. Ziegler, Dr. Mahoney. I can remember Dr. Mahoney, one time I was at the nurses station, and remember when I came to Nantucket Cottage Hospital, nurses stood up when physicians walked into the room, or you gave them your chair, and we would give them their chair and open up a chart, and it would be full of ashes. Because Dr. Cassidy or Dr. Ziegler were sitting there smoking cigars or cigarettes. The other thing, too, is I remember, nursing was advancing, as Charlene had mentioned. When we started, nursing was at this level, and now we've got advanced practice nurses, and it's just amazing how nursing has evolved. But I can remember vividly having a stethoscope, and Dr. Mahoney had just come from Rochester, and he said, "What are you going to do with that?" I said, "Well, I thought perhaps I would listen to someone's lungs." And he said, "And what are you going to do with that information?" I said, "I thought I would tell you." So we have come a long way, baby.
And another factor that I think people really associate with Nantucket Cottage Hospital now, compared to when these women were working there, it used to be sort of a mecca for people to come and have plastic surgery, which I was surprised by, but these ladies knew all about this. And Kate, could you sort of kick that off?
We had a plastic surgeon, I can say his name, and everybody knows him, Dr. Peter Linden, and he was here for a number of years. We did a lot of plastic surgery, a ton of plastic surgery. And they even had a thing that they developed called cottage care. So these patients would come from like New York. They loved to come here because it was private. Nobody knew they had plastic surgery. They'd come here. They'd go back to New York. They said, "Wow, Nantucket is fabulous for you. You look terrific." I mean, meanwhile, after plastic surgery, they look like they got beat up. But cottage care was they'd go into a room after being like a patient for however many days they were allowed. Then they were a patient there. They had like a concierge service where they would stock the refrigerator with foods that they liked, and they could stay there and they would recuperate in Nantucket. One thing I always remember was we had an anesthesiologist who would come in August to relieve our usual anesthesiologist. His name was Dr. Van Dam, and he always wanted to come in August. That was the month he was coming no matter what. Well, our cases would start like at 8:30, 8:45, pretty casual. He came, and they would start at 7:30. He hated plastic surgery, and that is when we did a lot of plastic surgery, and he would have to sit through 8, 9 hours of plastic surgery, and it would drive him crazy. But we did a lot of surgery then, a lot of different cosmetic and non-cosmetic plastic surgery.
So the thing about Dr. Linden, he taught us a lot about how to do dressings. I was talking to Amy Israelian last night about how plastics, we learned a lot from a plastic surgeon. But Dr. The guy you were just talking about, Dr. Van Dam, he was in charge of bringing physicians to the emergency room. And, we had the privilege of working with some of the best and the brightest physicians in the country. We were all young together, we all grew up together. But, Dr. Jeff Drazen is now the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Very brilliant. Would you guys agree with that? For those of you who know him, brilliant. And we've had the pleasure of having a relationship with him since the 70s. We've had Dr. Colaccio, who was the head of surgery up at Dartmouth-Hitchcock. So we could go through the list of all the surgeons and all the doctors that we've had because Dr. Van Dam brought them down. And that's where we got to learn some of our skill sets. That's how we elevated our practice. So that was really quite good.
Some of these stories are funny, some of them made you laugh, but there's other stories that, these nurses have experienced that where they, was a little harrowing for them. We're in dangerous situations. It still happens to all of our nurses today when you're taking care of patients. Suzanne shared with us a story that I thought was really interesting. You might want to tell our audience tonight.
Oh, probably 1971. There's a lot of happenings on Nantucket. And I was working nights, and there was 2 other people working with us. Chris Santos, I'm sure many of you remember her, was in OB. We had had a baby. And Jean Keating was another nurse that had born, raised, and lived in Nantucket and was working with us at the time. And it was just the usual night. We had our 40, 45, 50 patients. And all of a sudden I hear this unbelievable just noise, rattling and everything. So I went to the stairway by the cafeteria, and there was a gentleman, a very tall, probably 6'10", 6'8", maybe I'm exaggerating, but it was 7'10", what it looked like to me, who actually, and it was cold weather, he had taken the whole door off to come into the hospital. I mean, the heavy door at the bottom. He came running up the stairs, and he grabbed me by the arm and said he had to see Jack Kennedy, President Jack Kennedy. Now, I knew this wasn't going to happen at our hospital, but he ran me down the hallway, and I just kept saying I had hoped the nurse that was working with me on the floor would call the police, because I didn't know what to do. We went down the stairs. At that time, the maids and the cooks in the hospital, they lived downstairs near where the lab is now, but they didn't wake. But he kept saying, "You've got to show me the room where Jack Kennedy is." And of course, it was impossible. I said to him, "I think he's a patient upstairs. Let's go upstairs." He was cooperative, came right up the stairs with me, and the shortest policeman that Nantucket ever had. And I remember reading about this policeman in the Boston Globe is standing there to take care of me. The man went off with the policeman, and that was the end. But it was frightening because I didn't know where he was going with all of this. And to have actually come in, not by opening or calling or anything else, but take the whole door right off. But anyway, security was something that we did. We washed floors, we changed beds, cleaned beds. We were the security. At 11 to 7 at night, you went around and made sure all doors were locked, especially to the ER. Proved different sometimes. Believe me. Go down, our narcotic box was missing or something. But you couldn't see outside. You didn't know who you were getting or who was coming in, and sometimes people just got in.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I did promise at the beginning that we wanted to open this up to the audience for any of our current or former nurses to share a memory if you'd like, or to the audience if they have questions for our panelists. There's Marjan or Brianna is going to come around with the mic, so just raise your hand.
Peter Shaw, night shift, back in the early 90s. Peter Shaw was a funny character. He would hide. So you'd be going down to take care of your patient's needs, and you wouldn't know where he was. I always thought, okay, I know where he is. I'm safe to walk down this hall and take care of this patient. And he scared me so many times jumping out of an empty patient's room. Peter Shaw was very good at watching very carefully. 3 o'clock in the morning, it was hard to keep your eyes open. But he was watching, and if you ever dared close your eyes, even though you're sitting straight up and thinking, okay, I'm just gonna close them for 1 second and then I'll open them right back up. He would get out a black magic marker and he would draw a mustache on you or something. I will never forget those nights with him.
Does anyone else have something they'd like to share or a question for our panelists?
We know there's some good
right over
stories
here.
in this room. All right, here I come.
Thank you. It was really good to have the plastic surgery stories confirmed because I've heard them ever since I came to Nantucket, but I didn't know they were true. The other story I always heard was that this was the best place in the world to be if you had a moped accident. Remember when everybody rented mopeds for the first time here and then drove them into trees? Is that true that they all wind up in your emergency rooms, or was
I
that
can
unusual?
tell you
And then
that
they'd
they
get
did.
flown off island.
But they all started at the hospital, and I can remember vividly people. Mopeds are, first of all, terrible things. They're terrible. And I can remember many honeymoon couples having road rash burns on freshly asphalted roads, and trying to get that off of them was just painful. Plus the head injuries. I mean, really bad injuries from mopeds. So please don't get a moped.
One of our physicians was very instrumental in the helmet law, very instrumental. So we'd had enough head injuries by that time to really stand behind him to go forward with that.
Oh, yeah.
Other questions? Oh, back there.
Yes, maybe I didn't hear, but was Jack Kennedy actually in the hospital?
Not at that time. This was 1971, so.
So when we had when we were getting ready to move the dorm, which was very nostalgic for a lot of us for multiple reasons. I mean, you've got hundreds of years of history sitting at this table, but you also have hundreds of years sitting in front of me. I mean, Betty McDonald and Jean Bennett, I worked with them, Betsy Minahan, certainly new people, but Vi Allen, I didn't have the pleasure of working with you, Vi, but I certainly had the pleasure of your swift cut of the paddle ball. Jamie Duran is sitting there. The Craig sisters are all there. Joan Craig was my grandmother's closest friend, and I can remember she was the reason I became a volunteer. And I think Joan had the most volunteer hours of any volunteer at Nantucket Cottage Hospital, and God bless Sandy, who was amazing in everything he did for the hospital. Yeah, I mean, I look around and I see the nurses that we work with now, and I think that, for me, it's when I'm sitting up with these ladies, I can remember my husband having to go into the hospital, and remember he worked there. When Janet and Suzanne were on, he felt confident that they would take care of him. When Kate and Jill and I got called in for surgery, sometimes with our waiters on, patients felt confident that we would take good care of them. Charlene was a wonderful mentor and brought a good skill set to us, and we felt confident in her ability to help us take care of patients. So I really wouldn't want to be in any other hospital. Yeah, you go to Mass General or the other hospitals, but this is where I want to be taken care of, and I still feel that way. And the more I spend time with these ladies, the more I feel that way.
So one thing very happy that those walls can't talk at the door.
Yeah, we said before we came out that this is
Yes.
really like the PG, maybe PG-13 version of.
So many stories we can't tell.
Was there a question back there? Did I see a hand up? Okay. Well, back there, yes.
That walked in the room to now probably telling him what they're supposed to do every day. But just from your point of view as a fellow nurse who's about to retire, what's your feeling about the future of nursing right now? Are you worried about it? Do you think I'm worried about what's happening with nursing, and I was wondering how you girls felt about it.
So let me just start. I think my concern with nursing is obviously I'm not getting younger. And I'm concerned that there's going to be enough nurses to take care of us. So, of course, we're going to be going on to physician extenders and all sorts of things. I think what I worry about nursing-wise is is the compassion and the caring and the kindness and concern that I believe we all have. And I don't know how you get that. I don't know whether that's something that's taught or whether that's an innate quality that we all have. I don't know. But that concerns me. You know, whoever takes care of me and mine, and trust me, it's all about, we're building this new hospital, and this hospital's taking, the one that we have now and the new one, the old one, has taken care of at least 7 generations of my family, and my hope is we continue to take care of. I'm just hoping that the people that are taking our places are kind and compassionate, and because I expect them to be the best. So that's where I'm at.
So I have no worries about nursing as a career because I think that nursing continues to be, and probably has always been, always on the cutting edge. If it's sort of the most general profession within healthcare from which you can branch off to any different specialty. So if you like psych, you can be in psych. If you like OR, you can be in OR. You can go branch off into any specialty, and you can work in hospital, in communities, in nursing homes. There are just so many different opportunities within nursing that I actually always encourage everybody, if they have an interest in healthcare at all, to start with nursing because it gives them such a great jumping off point. I echo what Brenda says. I think that one of the things that we need to make sure of is that as well as the clinical skills and knowledge base and competence that nurses have, they really continue to have the compassion and caring and recognizing that we need to treat everybody as a whole person, body, mind, spirit, and that we need to pay attention to not only the person with the illness, but their families as well, because it needs to be very holistic. But as long as we can keep mentoring people that are coming along to develop those skills and also to develop those qualities, then I think we're in great shape. Might not get paid enough, but
I also think as nurses we have a voice, and we're listened to. We've come a long way over the years, and we don't stand up for the physicians anymore. We are able to speak to them, they listen to us, they hear what we're saying, so we have a voice. And with the new electronic age, things are changing so fast. There's definitely a place continued for nurses, specialized and general. I don't see nursing changing as far as a great field to go into, a great caring field to go into.
And Jill, I think you had a couple parting comments that you'd want to share with everyone before we wrap up here tonight.
I wanted to say that one of the things that really intrigued me about Nantucket and kept me is the close-knit community and how we cared for our families, our patients, and we might end up having our families as our patients. And I never had that anywhere else. We had it from day one when I arrived, and it continues today, that we are a wonderful, caring group who care for our families and our patients as if they were families also. It's a tight community. We might be growing, but we still have that wonderful experience in hospital here. Thank you. We have a lot of nurses who are no longer with us who we also want to remember too. So just, this has been a good gathering for us and a good memory for us.
But a round of applause for the nurses here. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. We really appreciate you being here.
And before we depart, I wanted to thank Jason Gratiaday for being a wonderful moderator. I know that it was a very talented panel, but you did a fantastic job. So a round of applause for Jason. I just had this idea. We talked about, I think, Brenda, you first mentioned it, and Jill, you brought it up again, this idea of standing for doctors who, I think doctors are fabulous too, so round of applause for all the doctors. I wonder if we might take a moment and stand for our cottage hospital nurses as a final thank you. I think that would be really lovely. many of you in the audience tonight who are nurses, who are in the healthcare profession. So from all of us on the history community side to all of us on the healthcare community side, we just wanted to say thank you. And we can't wait to see you at our next installment of Nantucket Cottage Stories. So thank you very much.